People keep calling Shedeur Sanders arrogant, like they've cracked the code on who he is, like the confidence is fake, like the swagger is something he borrowed from his last name. But what if the part everyone judges him for is the exact thing that was built into him on purpose? Because Deion Sanders just did something that didn't look like a publicity stunt, didn't look like a flex, and definitely didn't look like a normal father-son day out. He took Shedeur and Shiloh back to the place where the Sanders story actually started. Not the stadium lights, not the cameras, not the brand. The kind of place most people work their entire lives trying to forget. And what they saw out there explains more about Shedeur's mindset than 1,000 hot takes ever could. We're talking condemned apartments, a patch of grass that doubled as a football field, a laundromat that wasn't a memory. It was the reason kids had to get creative just to play. And then it gets darker, literally, because Deion walked them into the area where he says he got his speed, running full sprint into graveyard darkness with no street lights, chasing the only thing that made it feel safer, a car's headlights coming down the road. That doesn't sound like training, that sounds like survival. And the wild part is, this was Deion trying to make his sons feel guilty for having more. It was him trying to make sure they never confuse comfort with softness, never confuse privilege with weakness, never forget what the prime time persona was really built on. Then came the moment that turned this from a personal lesson into something bigger. A local resident recognized them and got visibly nervous, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And someone with Deion said something that stuck hard. When you're in a hopeless situation, hope isn't dead, it's just suspended. And seeing somebody make it out can turn it back on instantly. So yeah, this story is about a trip back home. But it's also about why Shedeur's confidence hits people the wrong way, and why that might be exactly why he's built for what's coming next. The first stop wasn't some landmark people put on postcards. It was an apartment complex. Building 7C, the kind of place where, if you didn't grow up around it, you drive past fast and never think twice. But Deion didn't bring Shedeur and Shiloh there for a photo. He brought them there to make one thing impossible to ignore. This is what before the fame actually looked like. Deion starts talking, and it doesn't sound like a motivational speech. It sounds like a survival manual. He tells them how, back then, everybody looked out for each other. His mom could leave for work and still know somebody would make sure he got to school. That's not community, the way people say it online. That's a neighborhood operating like a safety net because there's no other safety net coming. Then he points out a small cut of grass between the buildings. No stadium, no clean field lines, no lights, just space. And he tells them plain as day that's where he learned to play football. And here's the detail that changes the whole vibe. He didn't even have a real football. He talks about using a milk jug. A milk jug. That's not a cute story. That's what happens when you're a kid with energy, dreams, and nothing to work with, so you turn whatever you can grab into the game. Even the laundromat comes up like it's part of the same memory. Not because it's sentimental, but because it's reality. Nobody had washers and dryers, so the laundromat was the center of the routine. And right in the middle of that routine, Deion is learning timing, angles, toughness, and imagination, with trash turned into a ball. Now think about what that means for Shedeur standing there listening. He grew up with real fields, real equipment, real training. People see that and decide they already know him. Soft, spoiled, doesn't get it. But this is Deion making sure his sons do get it. Because confidence hits different when you know exactly what it costs to create the opportunities you're living in. And just when you think the lesson is only about resourcefulness, Deion takes them to the place where his speed was born, and it wasn't on a track. It was in the dark, with fear on both sides of the road. The grass between those buildings was already a reality check. But Deion didn't stop there, because creativity isn't the only thing poverty teaches you. Sometimes it teaches you how to move when you're scared, and never admit you're scared. He takes Shedeur and Shiloh down a road he remembers like it's burned into him. And the mood shifts, because this isn't about back in my day stories anymore. Deion starts pointing out what used to surround him. Graveyards on both sides, darkness, no street lights, nothing that makes a kid feel safe walking home. Then he drops the line that makes everything click. Deion says this is where he got his speed. Not from a trainer, not from genetics alone, not from some perfect sprint program. He describes how they'd wait for a car to come down the road, and the second those headlights appeared, they'd take off full speed. Wide open. No packing themselves. No saving energy. Just sprinting like they had somewhere to be right now. And the reason is simple. Those headlights were the only light they had. That's what makes the story hit. Because when people talk about primetime speed, they imagine highlights and scoreboard graphics. Deion is telling you it came from fear and darkness, running toward a graveyard because standing still felt worse than moving fast. Then he adds another detail that sounds almost unreal until you remember where they are. He talks about mangoes, about how in the hood, fruit doesn't always get the chance to ripen because somebody going to knock it down early. So kids would go mango hunting, even around the graveyard, just trying to get something extra. Not a snack from a kitchen, not a trip to a store, a hunt. And if you're Shedeur standing there, listening to your dad connect speed, hunger, and survival like it's one story, it changes how you see everything. It reframes the swagger people love to criticize, because it didn't start as showmanship. It started as a kid learning that the world doesn't give you comfort, so you build your own edge. But the deepest part of this trip wasn't even the graveyard story. It was what happened when someone still living in that environment saw Deion standing there in real life, and you could almost watch a person's hope switch back on. Here, where the trip stopped being just a family moment and turned into something way heavier. While Deion is walking Shedeur and Shiloh through these places, condemned buildings, dark roads, the same corners he ran through as a kid, a resident steps out and notices what's happening. And you can tell immediately the guy isn't sure how to act. He looks nervous, like his brain is trying to catch up to what his eyes are seeing. Because imagine you're still living in that environment, still staring at the same walls, the same worn-down apartments, the same daily routine. And then Deion, prime time, Sanders is standing right there like it's normal. Shiloh ends up jumping in, almost like he can see the confusion on the man's face. He tells him basically, "You know who this is, right? That's Deion, prime time." And the guy admits he's shook. He doesn't know what to say. He's not putting on a show, he's genuinely overwhelmed. And that's when someone with Deion says something that quietly explains the whole moment in one sentence. When you're stuck in a hopeless situation, hope isn't gone, it's just suspended. It's like a light that got turned off, not because the power disappeared forever, but because nothing around you has given you a reason to turn it back on. Until now. Because standing there is living proof that someone can come from the exact same place and make it out. Not make it out in a small way either. Make it out so loud the whole world knows his name. And when you see that up close, your mind starts doing something dangerous in a good way. You start imagining options again. You start thinking, wait, if he did it, then maybe this place doesn't get to decide my entire future. That's why this wasn't a nostalgia tour. Deion wasn't just showing his sons where he came from. He was showing them what their presence does to people who are still there. How a name, a legacy, a family can accidentally become a mirror for somebody else's life. And if you're Shedeur watching that unfold, it puts a different weight on everything. Because now it's not just, my dad is famous. It's, my dad is a symbol. And whether people like it or not, that symbol is attached to me too. Which leads straight to the real lesson Deion was teaching. Because this trip wasn't designed to humble Shedeur by shamming him. It was designed to turn privilege into responsibility. The internet loves a simple label, and Shedeur gets hit with the easiest one, privileged kid. The kind of label that comes with an automatic conclusion, soft, entitled, doesn't understand real struggle. And if you only look at the surface, you can see why people try it. He had access. He had training. He had cameras around him early. He walked into rooms with confidence like he belonged there. But Deion didn't take his sons back to Fort Myers to apologize for giving them more. He took them back to make sure they never misunderstand what more actually costs. Because privilege in the Sanders family wasn't inherited like some random gift. It was built, brick by brick, sprint by sprint, milk jug by milk jug. It came from a kid who had to create a game out of nothing, who had to move fast in the dark, who had to treat community like a survival system because nobody else was coming to save them. And when Shedeur stands in front of a condemned building and hears his father say, "This is where it started," that's not a guilt trip. That's an anchor. It's Deion basically telling him, you can be confident, but don't ever let your confidence float. Tie it to reality. Tie it to sacrifice. Tie it to the fact that comfort doesn't happen by accident. That's also why the arrogance argument starts falling apart when you look closer. Because what people call arrogance is often just the Sanders standard. Speak like you expect greatness, then go chase it like you're starving. That mentality didn't come from being handed things. It came from watching a father who refused to accept the limits of his zip code. And there's another layer here that people don't like admitting. When a young QB is confident, the reaction is rarely just about football. The same traits get described differently depending on who's watching. One person calls it leadership. Another calls it ego. One person calls it command. Another calls it attitude. That's why Shedeur's confidence becomes a fight instead of a discussion. But standing in those exact places, hearing those exact stories, Shedeur is getting the message Deion really wants him to carry into the next level. You don't shrink to make people comfortable. You also don't waste what was paid for. And that's where this trip points next, because the lessons weren't only emotional. They translate directly to what happens when the lights turn on and the pocket collapses. And once you connect that, you start seeing Shedeur's game in a completely different way. The easiest way to spot whether someone has real inner toughness isn't when everything's clean. It's when the play breaks, the protection leaks, and the whole stadium feels like it's waiting on you to fold. That's where Shedeur's background starts showing up, not because he grew up in those apartments himself, but because he grew up under a man who did, and trained his mind like it. Watch how Shedeur plays when the pocket gets loud. He doesn't instantly turn his eyes into panic. He keeps scanning. He'll take a hit and still come back to the same throw on the next snap. And at Colorado, he had plenty of chances to prove that wasn't just talk. There were games where the pressure was constant, where he took punishment, where most young QBs would start rushing everything just to survive. Instead, he kept trying to operate like a quarterback, not a runner pretending to be one. That's not a small detail. That's the difference between a guy who can survive Saturdays and a guy who can survive Sundays. And it also explains why some people misread him so badly. Because Shedeur doesn't respond to pressure by acting smaller. He responds by getting sharper, more direct, more sure of himself. To certain fans and certain media voices, that sounds like attitude. But to anyone who understands how elite competitors are wired, it sounds like a coping mechanism that actually works. If the world is trying to speed you up, you slow your mind down and keep your standards up. That's basically the graveyard lesson, just in football form. Deion ran faster because the dark forced him to. Shedeur stays calmer because chaos forces him to. And when critics say, he's too confident, what they're really saying is, we do like how he looks when things aren't comfortable. But quarterbacks don't get paid for comfort. They get paid for the uncomfortable moments. Now, does that mean he's flawless? No. There are real areas he has to tighten up, getting the ball out faster in certain looks, protecting himself, choosing the boring answer when the heroic one isn't there. But the reason teams will still be intrigued is simple. You can coach timing. You can coach footwork. You can coach decisions. It's a lot harder to coach a guy not to flinch. And that leads right into the next part, because Deion didn't just pass down stories. He passed down a teaching style, one that most people can't even handle when he turns it all the way up. Deion said something on this trip that sounded like a flex at first, but it's actually a confession. He basically admitted he doesn't get many chances to give people everything he has, because what he has is operating on a level most people can't comprehend. So he ends up dumbing it down. That line tells you a lot about what's happening with Shedeur behind the scenes. Because Deion isn't just teaching mechanics or throwing tips. He's trying to transfer a mentality, how to move through pressure, how to treat doubt like fuel, how to walk into rooms that weren't built for you and act like you belong anyway. Most players want the surface stuff. They want a quick fix, a new drill, a shortcut. Deion talking about the deeper layer, the one that actually creates separation, standards, discipline, and the ability to stay locked in when the world is trying to pull you apart. And that's why this Fort Myers trip matters more than a motivational quote ever could. It's a curriculum. It's Deion giving Shedeur context for the Sanders confidence so it doesn't become cosplay, so it doesn't become just swagger. It becomes a grounded thing, tied to real sacrifice. That's also why the "he's arrogant" criticism keeps missing the mark. Arrogance is empty. It's a loud mouth with no foundation. What Deion is building in Shedeur is the opposite. Confidence with receipts. Confidence that understands where it came from. Confidence that knows people in condemned buildings are watching, not because they care about a stat line, but because they want proof that life can change. And if you're Shedeur, that changes how you carry yourself. Because now you're not just playing for validation. You're playing to honor a price that was already paid, fear in the dark, hunger in the graveyard, a neighborhood that had to raise a kid because his mom had to work. That's why Deion can't teach every player the same way. Not everyone wants that weight. Not everyone can hold it without cracking. But his sons, they've been around it since day one. They know the standard isn't look good. The standard is don't waste anything. And here's the final layer that makes this whole story hit. Deion didn't bring them back so they could feel sad. He brought them back so they'd feel responsible. Because the next stage for Shedeur isn't about proving he belongs in a league. It's about proving he can carry a legacy without letting the noise rewrite it. And that's where this story ends, but the real test begins. And this is the part scouts and media people rarely say out loud. The NFL doesn't just draft quarterbacks. It drafts how a quarterback will be talked about for the next 5 years. That's why Shedeur's confidence gets treated like a crime scene. Not because confidence is automatically bad, but because the league has a long history of using certain code words when they don't know what box to put a player in. Too flashy, too much attention, comes with baggage. Half the time, those phrases aren't even about the player's work ethic. They're about the organization's comfort level with being watched. And the Fort Myers trip is basically Deion's way of inoculating his sons against that whole circus. Because when you've stood in front of your father's condemned building and heard him explain how the neighborhood had to raise him while his mom worked, it becomes a lot harder to get shaken by a podcast clip. When you've heard your dad say his speed came from sprinting through graveyards with no lights, you stop pretending the NFL is the scariest thing you'll ever face. The pressure doesn't disappear, but it loses its power to distort you. This is also where Shedeur gains a sneaky advantage in interviews. Teams aren't only going to ask about coverages and protections. They're going to probe the story. They'll test how he responds to criticism. They'll ask about leadership, accountability, and how he handles being a headline. And rumors suggest some teams may even press the Deion angle directly, trying to figure out whether the attention is something Shedeur feeds on, or something he can manage without letting it eat the locker room alive. Most young prospects answer those questions like they're reading off a card. Shedeur can answer them with receipts, not stats, context. He can explain where his mindset comes from, why confidence isn't a performance, and why he doesn't fold when people try to shrink him. And that's what makes this story bigger than a back to the hood moment. Deion didn't just show his sons where he came from. He handed them something the league can't teach. Perspective with weight behind it. Because from here on out, Shedeur isn't just going to be graded on throws. He's going to be graded on whether he can carry the noise without letting it rewrite who he is. And that's where the final takeaway hits hardest. If you watched that Fort Myers trip and only saw Deion visiting home, you missed what was really happening. That wasn't nostalgia. That wasn't content. That was a father handing his sons a blueprint, one that explains exactly why the Sanders confidence is built different. The milk jug story isn't just a fun detail. It's proof that greatness can start with nothing, as long as you've got imagination and hunger. The laundromat wasn't just a stop on a tour. It was a reminder that daily life used to be a grind, and football had to be squeezed into whatever space was left. The graveyard runs weren't a scary childhood anecdote. They were training. The kind you don't sign up for, the kind that gets forced on you, and the kind that hardwires a person to move through fear instead of freezing. And that suspended hope moment with the resident, that might be the loudest part of the whole trip, because it shows Deion isn't just a Hall of Famer, he's living evidence. A walking, it's possible. And now Shedeur carries that same effect whether he asks for it or not. When he steps into a stadium, he isn't only representing himself. He's representing every kid who's staring at the same kind of buildings Deion pointed at and wondering if life ever changes. So when people call Shedeur arrogant, it's worth asking. Are they seeing arrogance? Or are they seeing a young man who refuses to act small because he knows what acting small costs? Because once you understand where Deion came from, milk jugs, graveyards, mango hunting, you start to realize Shedeur's confidence isn't about being handed the world. It's about being taught to never waste it. And that's the real takeaway. Privilege doesn't make you weak. Forgetting the price does. But if you've walked the same dark roads your father sprinted down, you don't forget. So I want to hear from you. Does seeing Deion's real upbringing change how you view Shedeur's swagger? And do you think the NFL is better at evaluating quarterbacks or better at shaping narratives around them? Drop your take in the comments.